There's been hubbub for literally over a year about James Comey's firing. James Comey was fired as head of the FBI because James Comey refused to say that President Trump was in the clear with regard to the Russia investigation, or at least that President Trump was not under investigation. And Trump got mad about that, and so he fired James Comey. He made that pretty clear at the time. Well, James Comey immediately came out after that, just to recapitulate the history. James Comey came out after that, and he leaked some contemporaneous memos to one of his friends, a Columbia University law professor. He took these memos that he'd written that were supposed to be notes of meetings that he'd had with Trump, and he leaked them to one of his friends so that they'd get out in the press with the express purpose of trying to get a special prosecutor involved. The idea here was this, that President Trump had fired Comey, and now the DOJ had recommended that on the basis of Rod Rosenstein. So remember, Jeff Sessions had recused himself from everything Russia-related, and that meant that Rod Rosenstein, the deputy attorney general, was the guy who wrote a letter saying that James Comey should be fired. President Trump used that letter as the basis for firing James Comey. James Comey then leaked a bunch of memos about his relationship with Trump to the press in the hopes that that Rosenstein would have to recuse himself and appoint a special prosecutor. Because once it became clear that Trump had actually done this over the Russia stuff and Rosenstein had been involved in the firing of James Comey, then suddenly a special prosecutor is necessary. That's why these memos became a big issue in the first place. It was on the basis of these memos that James Comey was called in front of Congress to testify. It was on the basis of these memos that James Comey got his big book deal. And it's on the basis of those memos that James Comey is now running around on television every single night. So yesterday, the DOJ turned over these memos to Congress. There's some controversy related to this because remember, the DOJ had suggested that originally these memos could not become public because it would be a serious infringement on national security. Classified material would make it into the public sphere if these memos were to be made public. And there's an ongoing investigation involving the memos. Why should they be given to Congress? Well, yesterday they said, fine, we'll hand them over to Congress. Okay, and then within 5 minutes of them being handed over to Congress, the Associated Press had them, the Washington Post had them, everybody in the press had them. And so here is what you need to know from the Comey memos. First of all, there's really nothing groundbreaking about the Comey memos themselves. So everything that you knew that James Comey had already said, he said in these memos. So his contemporaneous memos are very consistent with what he has been saying publicly. According to James Comey, he went to President Trump. He told him about the Russian dossier that was compiled by Christopher Steele at the behest of Fusion GPS, which was paid by the Hillary Clinton campaign. So try to follow me here. Hillary Clinton paid Fusion GPS, which paid Christopher Steele to compile a dossier on President Trump. And that dossier made its way to the FBI. And James Comey showed the most salacious parts of that dossier to President Trump. And Trump and Comey at length discussed the infamous P tape. Of course, this is the portion of the dossier alleging that President Trump went to Russia in 2013 and had Russian prostitutes pee on a bed once occupied by the Obamas, which is real weird. Okay. And then Trump apparently told Comey at one point that Putin had bragged about the quality of Russian hookers, which is like, okay, whatever. And then apparently Trump joked about jailing reporters and Comey laughed about it. And Trump said that Michael Flynn had serious judgment issues, which is not a great shock. He ended up firing his national security advisor, Michael Flynn, and then asking James Comey if there was any way he could see himself clear to letting Michael Flynn go, which is not obstruction since he didn't actually pressure Comey to let Michael Flynn go. So why do these memos matter? Why do these memos matter? Well, there are a few reasons these memos matter. So on the left, they're suggesting these memos matter because James Comey now looks more consistent. It looks like he's been consistent in his story throughout. Okay, fair enough. But there are some problems for James Comey in the memos. Okay, first problem for James Comey in the memos. First of all, the memos themselves have some redactions. That means that some of the material in the memos is still classified. Well, that raises a question. Was James Comey leaking classified material from his memos to the press? If so, that's actually a crime. Now, Comey says he only leaked one memo to his friends, and that memo was unclassified, but we're going to have to figure this thing out because the fact is that according to the letter from the DOJ to Congress releasing these memos, quote, pursuant to your request, we are providing the requested memoranda in both redacted and unredacted formats for your convenience. The unredacted documents are classified, and we will provide those in a separate secure transmittal to the House Security Office tomorrow, which seems to imply that Comey's memos were not all unclassified. Okay, also, this seems to suggest that the DOJ fibbed about the importance of the memos in the first place. As I mentioned, the DOJ refused to turn over the memos when requested under the Freedom of Information Act last year. They claimed that the release of the memos would somehow impede the Mueller investigation. Nothing in the memo seems to suggest this is true. The memos also do not suggest obstruction, so this is a point in favor of President Trump. After the release of the memos, Representatives Devin Nunes, Bob Goodlatte, Trey Gowdy, they tore into Comey. They said, quote, the memos show that the president made clear he wanted allegations of collusion, coordination, and conspiracy between his campaign and Russia fully investigated. Furthermore, the memos demonstrate that Trump didn't want Russian election interference investigation ended. but the suggestion that he had engaged in lewd personal conduct, he wanted it investigated. So he was much more concerned with the allegations about the P-tape than he was concerned about the idea that Russia interfered in the election. He wasn't seeking to shut anything down or direct the investigation in any particular direction except on the P-tape, according to the Comey memos. As the congressmen point out, the memos also show former Director Comey never wrote that he felt obstructed or threatened, which is, of course, true. He didn't feel obstructed or threatened until he was fired, at which point it became sour grapes. Maybe I was fired because of obstruction, as opposed to I was fired because I'm wildly incompetent at my job. It is also true that these memos show that James Comey held the Trump administration and President Trump to a different standard than he held members of the Obama administration. So Comey has stated he interfered in the Hillary Clinton email investigation in an unprecedented way, right? He went out there, he did his big press conference where he announced basically why Hillary Clinton should be indicted and then said she shouldn't be indicted. He did that in an attempt to shield Loretta Lynch, the Attorney General, from allegations of bias or corruption. Well, he never wrote contemporaneous memos about his meetings with Loretta Lynch or Barack Obama during that time, even though he was so worried about it that he interfered in the middle of an investigation in a way that is wildly unprecedented. He only reserved those memos for Trump. And this is what the congressmen point out. They say, quote, he chose not to memorialize conversations with President Obama, Attorney General Lynch, Secretary Clinton, Andrew McCabe, or others, but he immediately began to memorialize conversations with President Trump. These memos also lay bare the notion that former Director Comey is not motivated by animus. Comey also never bothered to try to launch a special counsel investigation against Lynch and Clinton through leaks. Also worth noting in these memos, Comey defended McCabe repeatedly and personally to President Trump. It now turns out that McCabe was, in fact, lying repeatedly and now is under criminal investigation. That came out yesterday that Andrew McCabe has been now referred by the IG for criminal investigation on the basis of leaking to the press a bunch of stories about his involvement in the Hillary Clinton Foundation scandal and his attempts to investigate it. So the Comey memos don't actually help Comey's case. In fact, they sort of hurt it. They don't show us anything we didn't already know. But they do undercut the case that Comey was being pressured in any real way by President Trump. All of this prompted President Trump to tweet. So here's what President Trump tweeted about all of this. Quote, James Comey memos just out and show clearly there was no collusion and no obstruction. Also, he leaked classified information. Wow. Will the witch hunt continue? Okay, so again, do I think it's ill-advised for Trump to tweet this? Yes, but is he right? Yeah, he is. I mean, there's no collusion, no obstruction, and it is pretty clear that he may have leaked classified information. So all of this whole thing, this whole special counsel investigation, which was launched on the basis, not the Russia investigation, the special counsel Mueller investigation, which was launched on the back of Comey's memos, seems really weak. There's another theory that is now being put out there by Molly Hemingway over at the Federalist that is worth noting here. That what the memos really show is that that James Comey and James Clapper, the former head of the CIA, and the press were in cahoots in their attempts to get the information about the P-tape out into the public sphere. So here's what Molly Hemingway writes. So she writes, quote, in multiple memos, Comey specifically mentioned that CNN had the dossier, the famous P-tape dossier, and wanted a news hook that would enable the network to report on its most salacious allegations, even though they had not been verified. So in the memos, it says this, quote, I said the Russians allegedly had tapes involving him and prostitutes at the presidential suite at the Ritz-Carlton in Moscow from about 2013. I said I wasn't saying this was true, only that I wanted him to know both that it had been reported and that the reports were in many hands. No media organizations had reported the allegations at the time that Comey briefed Trump, says Molly Hemingway. I said media like CNN had them and were looking for a news hook, Comey added in his memo about the briefing with Trump on January 6, 2017. On January 28, 2017, Comey wrote that in a separate meeting, Trump mentioned the allegation about the alleged tape of prostitutes at the hotel and called it fake news. Comey said, I explained again why I had thought it important that he know about it. I also explained that one of the reasons we told him was that the media, CNN in particular, was telling us they were about to run with it. Well, this is all weird. Why is this weird? Because on January 10th, just 4 days after James Comey briefed the president of the United States about the P-tape, there was a CNN story, and it said, quote, Intel chiefs presented Trump with claims of Russian efforts to compromise him. Extremely well-placed sources told CNN that the Obama administration's top intelligence appointees had briefed Obama, Biden, and Trump all about a dossier they took incredibly seriously and considered credible. But it sounded really bad, as the headline indicated. CNN declared Russian operatives claimed to have compromising personal and financial information about Mr. Trump. And just a few minutes later, BuzzFeed published the actual dossier, showing the world that the dossier was riddled with salacious gossip that lacked even a possibility of corroboration. So remember, here's the logic. James Comey and company, right? They tell Trump that we may have a media scandal on our hands if they can find a news hook. And then what does CNN use as the news hook? The fact that James Comey told President Trump that he may have a media scandal on his hand. You see how the circular system works here? So I'll explain more of that in just a second. First, back to the reports about the Comey memo that are really interesting. Now, this has not been substantiated, but the going theory now on the right seems to be that James Comey and company went to President Trump and informed him about the P-tape dossier, not just because they wanted to inform him, but maybe because they wanted to leak the news that that meeting had taken place so that CNN could use it as a news hook. Right, this is what Molly Hemingway is saying over at the Federalist. She says, keep in mind that nothing we now know about the dossier had been reported at the time. It wasn't yet reported that it was used by the FBI to provide a substantial basis to wiretap at least one Trump affiliate, despite the fact that it was unverified. It wasn't yet reported that the product was bought and paid for as a Hillary Clinton campaign operation, or that it was secretly funded by the DNC using a law firm as a pass-through to hide its provenance in federal campaign filings. After nearly a year of wrangling, the 7 memos written by Comey were finally handed over on Thursday to Congress, which oversees the operation and funding of the FBI and DOJ. The memos purport to show Comey's version of his interactions with the president before Comey was fired last May. But Molly Hemingway says, listen, something weird is going on here, right? That Comey claims that James Clapper over at the CIA wanted Trump to be briefed on the P-tape and on the dossier. And in the briefing, in his notes, he told Trump, CNN has this information. They may run with it at any time. They just need a news hook. And the very news hook that CNN used was, Trump has now been briefed about this stuff. So if it wasn't Comey, then that does raise some questions about James Clapper, because Clapper obviously is a highly partisan player. And if James Clapper was basically using this as an excuse to get the P-tape nonsense out there in the first place, that is pretty damning and very, very troubling. In any case, none of this is particularly troubling for President Trump. I mean, the only material on the table right now that could be a serious problem for President Trump is whatever the FBI's got from Michael Cohen, right? That's the stuff that could actually hurt President Trump. But this P-tape stuff, the dossier stuff, the Comey memos, none of them actually seem to be breaking any significant news. James Comey still won't leave our TV screens, however, because he's got a book to shill. And it's amazing to watch as James Comey backs off of his own strong position that Trump may be compromised. So he was asked by Jake Tapper yesterday whether President Trump has been compromised by Russia. Now, remember, the reason that he told President Trump about the P-tape in the first place is because of the possibility that Trump might actually be affected by so-called compromise, right? James Comey says, actually, it's kind of unlikely that Russia has that sort of compromising information.
I'm not going to talk about the investigation of possible cooperation between Americans and the Russian effort to influence our election. What you're asking about now is, why did I say what I said when people asked me whether I thought it was possible that the Russians had derogatory information on President Trump? I think it's unlikely, but I think it's possible.
Unlikely but possible is different from what he said earlier, which is he said it was just possible. But now it's unlikely but possible. Bottom line is Comey has no news to break and the media are struggling for news. Well, in their struggle for news, James Comey tried to bring out another piece of information yesterday, and I'm going to explain that one here. So James Comey says that in the memos, Trump told him that he talked with Putin about hookers. So according to the memos, James Comey told Trump about the P-tape allegations, and Trump responded by saying that he had not spent the night in Russia. That may or may not be true. And then Trump said that he doesn't need hookers because he's very famous. Probably true. And then James Comey said to Trump that, and then Trump said to James Comey that Vladimir Putin does vouch for the hookers over in Russia. Okay, so James Comey is trying to break this as a big piece of news, and then we will explain why Trump probably said this in the first place.
I can't recall. I think there was public reporting that he had spoken to Vladimir Putin as sort of a welcome, congratulations on taking office thing at that point. I'm not suggesting they talked about how beautiful the hookers were in Russia, but I do know there was at least one publicly reported conversation. So
what exactly happened with the hookers? Why exactly did Trump say that in the first place to Comey? Probably because just a few days beforehand, Vladimir Putin had announced to the world that Russia has the best hookers. This happened about like a week and a half before Trump told Comey about Putin talking about hookers. The chances that Putin actually talked directly with Trump about hookers are extraordinarily low. But he did speak to the world about hookers, which is weird. So here was Vladimir Putin at the time talking about how great hookers were in Russia. He ran to a hotel to meet with our girls of reduced social responsibility. Oh, I love that euphemism. That's so good. Although here we also have the best ones in the world. Gotta hand to Vladimir Putin. When you're talking about prostitutes and you're bragging about the quality of your prostitutes, that is one leader of a country right there. That is probably why Trump said that. Not because Putin actually told Trump that the hookers in Russia were actually the best. Okay, so meanwhile, the other breaking news from all of the Trump-Russia stuff is that apparently Rudy Giuliani has now joined the team. Rudy Giuliani, of course, was very close with the Trump campaign. He was very involved in the Trump campaign. He has a very close and weird relationship with President Trump going back years. In fact, here's some early audio and video of President Trump, then just Donald Trump with the mullet. I mean, really, business in front, party in back. And Rudy Giuliani, this is about 1990, I believe.
You know, you're really beautiful. And a woman that looks like that.
Rudy Giuliani
has to
dressed in
have
a
a
wig
little
and fake
special
boobs, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Maybe you could tell me what you think of this set.
This is a thing
This
happened.
may be the best of all.
Oh, Me Too moment.
Boy, you. Oh. Donald, I thought you were a gentleman.
Okay, and then Trump actually says, well, you can't blame me for trying, or at least I tried. And then later, apparently, he would talk about this with Billy Bush, right? He moved on Rudy Giuliani very heavily. He moved on like a bleep. Okay, in any case, everything is very weird. Rudy Giuliani is joining the team because Giuliani does have some legal knowledge. Obviously, he was a prosecutor, and so he's joining the legal team in an effort to try and negotiate an end to the Mueller probe. That doesn't seem wildly out of bounds. It doesn't seem out of the realm of possibility either, because I'm not sure that Mueller actually has anything so far as this Russia collusion stuff goes. And the obstruction case is extremely weak, if by obstruction you mean that he fired James Comey. Even James Comey can't say that it was obstruction. Makes it very difficult to claim that there is serious obstruction by Team Trump. Now, again, the real danger to President Trump is not that. The real danger to President Trump is in the Michael Cohen stuff, in the fact that his personal lawyers' offices were raided on the basis of supposed campaign finance violations. Alan Dershowitz, who's been, a pretty strong legal ally for President Trump throughout this process, he says that President Trump has to assume that people are going to flip on him.
Prosecution has an enormous leverage. They can charge you with a dozen crimes, even if they're relatively technical crimes, that accumulate with the guidelines and tell you you're going to never see freedom again. You're going to serve the rest of your life in prison. That kind of pressure brings about not only singing, but sometimes composing. I think the president has to assume that his closest friends, his greatest associates, the people he trusts the most, if exposed to the pressure, the risk of life imprisonment, will flip. That has to be his working assumption.
Okay, so then the question becomes, what exactly does Michael Cohen have on President Trump? Maybe the answer is nothing. But that's the place where Trump really has vulnerability legally. The Mueller investigation is going to come to nothing. And I think that Trump knows that. I think Team Trump knows that. I think that's why they're being cooperative with Mueller. I think that's why Trump is really not concerned with firing Mueller, because all of that, after a year and a half of this nonsense, will finally come to an inglorious end. It'll really be on the Michael Cohen investigation. Democrats are now going to have to shift their hopes from Trump-Russia collusion to Michael Cohen engaging in some sort of illegal activity with Trump in order to push their impeachment hopes. Okay, so meanwhile, I just have to tell you the story, and then we'll get to the mailbag, because I want to do some mailbagging it up today. But this is an amazing story. So you remember that D.C. lawmaker, Trayon White? So Trayon White is a Democrat from Ward 8 in Washington, D.C., as a council member. And he had said, if you recall, that the weather was controlled by the Jews. He had blamed the Jews for the weather in Washington, D.C., which is a real weird thing. Like, we, the Jews, the Juden, we control many things, but we do not control the weather. As far as I'm aware. If not, I'll have to talk to the elders of Zion about it at my Friday night meeting. I mean, it's already Friday, so I figure tonight we'll get together and we'll talk about whether we can control the weather, because if so, then there are a few places that ought to be hit with lightning. But if not, it's real weird. So Trayon White, in an attempt to do penance for this, went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. So he said that he apparently spent some time on this tour, and it got very weird. So he suggested that an image of a German girl being marched through the streets of Norden in 1935 as humiliation for an alleged relationship with a Jew was actually depicting her being protected by Nazi troops surrounding her. There's a picture of a German woman wearing a sign around her neck, being paraded through the streets. And the sign says, "I slept with a Jew," basically. And this idiot, Trayon White, actually thought that this was the Nazis protecting this woman from the population outside, which is very, very weird. And that's when the museum experts pointed out that this was untrue. And then it apparently got weirder and weirder. Apparently he suggested that the Warsaw Ghetto was a gated community. Like, I'm not joking about this. This is an actual thing that happened. So he said that he saw a picture of the Warsaw Ghetto. He said, "Oh yeah, it's just like a gated community." No, it was more like a giant open air prison. So there was that. That's why there was an uprising there. I love that he did this like on the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Just tremendous awareness here. the other thing that I love about this, of course, is that the national media coverage has been relatively scant. So it was covered by the Washington Post. It was covered by Mediaite. But if this had been a Republican lawmaker of any caliber, it would be all over the front pages of every newspaper that this person went to a Holocaust museum and thought that the Warsaw Ghetto was a gated community. I mean, just absolutely asinine. But demonstrating once again that political correctness only runs in one direction.